Welcome to Brains on Games. I'm Dr. Brian McDonald, and this episode we're going to be talking about a card game, a two-player card game that's about dueling samurai called Katana. Like I said, this is a game for two players. It can be played by kids aged 8 and up, and it plays in about 15 to 30 minutes. This is a game that was designed by Tracy Alan, and I was lucky enough to speak with Tracy Alan yesterday about his game and the thought that went into the design. One of the things, you can see from the box art, one of the things that's interesting about this design is the style. Every choice that was made in creating this game is about creating an experience that immerses you in that culture of the samurai era of Japanese history. So there are cultural elements to the game that you'll see when we look at the cards, and there are some historical elements as well, but they're not necessarily overt. It's not a game that's teaching you something. It's a game that's about the experience. So let's take a look at the cards and we'll talk a little bit about the game and how it works. So here you can see the various kinds of cards that you're going to be playing with in Katana. Pretty stark, minimalist kind of design, mostly black and white with a little bit of red or a little bit of green. But the idea is that one player is going to be on the attack and might play an attack card, where the other player can then play a card to defend and subtract that amount off of the attack that's coming towards them. So it goes back and forth, but one of the things that creates some tension in the game is that there's a hand management component. You draw up to your full hand of cards. There's 5 cards in a hand, so you only can draw up to your full hand at the beginning of your turn, which means that whatever cards that you play during an attack, you don't have those cards in your hand to defend with. You see that each of the cards has an attack box and a defense box, okay? So you've got to think ahead about what cards you're going to need to defend yourself later on. So you might be having a good time and have some good cards for an attack, but you also may be wanting to think ahead and hold back a little bit because you're going to need those cards later. So if we're talking about holding back, some behavioral inhibition, you might call that. Behavioral inhibition is an example of an executive functioning skill. The skills that you need to be able to work towards a future goal, those are executive functions, and they include planning ahead, which is another thing that you have to do in this game, and behavioral inhibition. Let's look at a couple of other things about these cards, because each card has 3 different areas on it, and there's 3 different things that you can use that same card for. You can either attack, if it's your turn to do that, or defend, like we said earlier. After your attack, though, you put a card face down in front of you, and that's called your stance. So that's what's going to be your response to your opponent's counterattack when it's their turn. So you've got a face down card in front of you. This is the ability that it's going to give you. Your opponent doesn't know what that is when they're planning their attack. Okay, so here you can see that you'll flip that over and your next attack will get a bonus on it because of that stance. Here you can shatter your opponent's armor, you can reflect the attack back on your opponent. So those are the examples of some of the different stances that you can use in the game to sort of give a surprise to your opponent. So you're also saving cards for that stance. If you play all of your cards in attack, you don't have anything left to use because you can't draw up at the end of that turn. Now, a couple of things here. There's 3 different things that I just wanted to mention quickly about the game that's really the Japanese culture and history portion of it. And that is these cards are called kami. And the kami are the spirits that might help. Maybe they might get in the way, but usually you're hoping that they're going to help your samurai to win that battle. So in this case, you can see that the kami will allow you to draw your cards back up to your full hand at the end of your turn. So this ability allows you to break that rule. You don't have to be as careful about saving cards for defense if you have this ability. And the active ability that you can use by purifying you play a Purify card in order to activate the ability of your Kami, is that the enemy isn't allowed to draw cards. So the enemy has to be extra careful when they're facing up against this card. So the idea of purification or pollution, and I'll talk more about that with Tracy when we get on the call. Purification and pollution are important elements of the game, and there's a spiritual context to those things that kind of brings you into that Japanese cultural world. If you play a card that purifies or pollutes, the next thing you have to do is go to the shrine. So you draw a card, one of these shrine cards, and they might give you a bonus, but they aren't all good. So you might wind up with a penalty. So here you can see that you're going to lose some armor on that turn. So that's not a great thing. It's a risk to go to the temple, but that's a requirement. If you play one of these purify or pollute cards, you might get a bonus, like being able to see your enemy's cards. So you'll know what's coming up against you. It's a gamble to go to the shrine. You have to go there if you're purifying, or if you're facing pollution here with the Kami, and that's just another part of the sort of spiritual element of the game of Katana. Let's talk to Tracy Alan, the designer of Katana, about the game and about how he linked this history and culture to a game that might otherwise just be a typical back and forth battling card game. So Tracy, you are a historian by trade, really, right? Tell me about your interest in history.
Yeah, so I studied history and graphic design, and when I was doing that, I was trying to think of ways to merge the two disciplines. They're not really related very much. And I had some ideas like, I could lay out history books, I could do museum displays, but I've always enjoyed games. I used to work in the video game industry, and it's taken a step back from that to go back to school and study history and design, and kind of really enjoyed the tabletop game design process and the depth that it has, the possibility of depth, particularly in terms of history and being able to explore historical experience, and just different stories that I think you can do with card games and board games and the gamers who love those games in a way that's just different. The relationship with tabletop games is different than it is with video games and other types of media. And so I am sort of taking it on as my mission to do games that aren't just historical in the sense that you learn facts and names and dates, essentially trying to replicate the experience of reading a book. I don't think that's the way to go. I think there's a better way, and I think it's focusing on the historical experience and trying to figure out ways to translate that into gameplay mechanics that then lead to a player experience that is in some way touching back on that historical, previously lived past. So for me, that's what got me into history. I was never, I have a particular affinity for the ancient world, distant past. And so when I started learning about Greeks and Romans and Egyptians, I was really saddened by how little information we have about ordinary people's lives, or even people who existed somewhere in the middle of society. Mm-hmm. Most of the information, most of the historical sort of discussion of any culture really tends to be focused on the elite, the top, the rulers, and particularly politics. Politics is really the focus of much of history. And it has only been in the last few decades, really, since about the 70s, that people have, in the historical world, taken an interest in culture, in the individual, the ordinary things that previously were deemed unimportant because it didn't involve a king or a queen. So my first game, Katana, is does touch upon some politics and sort of traditional history in creating a backdrop, but the gameplay is focused on the experience of any Japanese warrior of the medieval period. It's about what it was like to actually be in their position of not only having to martially perform, essentially go to battle and win, but also the whole cultural set of dynamics related to religion, that if you were to not include that in the game would be an oversight. It would be missing this essential component to that historical experience of being a medieval Japanese warrior, in the same way that in our modern world, you couldn't write a Canadian or an American history without talking about Christianity or Islam, because they are part of the story. They're not the full story, and talking about them in no way is endorsing any particular religion or spirituality, but is instead saying that it's part of the experience. And that's what's important to me, because I think, in wrapping up my thought, I think there's too often a fixation on nitty-gritty detail, on trying to figure out what exactly happened in the past. And what I'm more concerned about is our concept, how we construct our image of the past today. That's what history is. History isn't something that we dig up from the ground or a set of documents that we have to, quote unquote, decipher in order to unlock the truth of the past. Instead, it's subjective. It's a story. And the story that we tell is the story that we decide to build. So the best stories are those that are based in evidence, but also hint upon what the actual human experience was. So I think, my games are always going to have that backdrop of academic, hard, historical, humanistic study and evidence, but really I want somebody to be able to play Katana, play any of my games, and not need to know the language of the culture, names and dates, and still walk away and say, make general statements about the experience, and walk away saying, yeah, that culture is different than mine. That they do things in a different way, and I experienced that through the way I was interacting with the game.
What are the biggest things, do you think, about Katana that make it different in that way from other battle card games? What are the things that you feel players will walk away and have that experience of having been sort of in touch with that historical Japanese culture?
So the first thing I would say, in a lot of ways, is detached from any specific culture, and that is, as a game, it's first and foremost an action game, which is unusual for a tabletop game, right? In fact, tabletop games tend to be the opposite. It tends to be not viewed as action oriented. It tends to be more strategic. Take your time, which you can do in my game because it's turn-based, but there's this sort of pressure for you to make an action because of the context of being in this sword fight. So from a design perspective, I was really intent on minimizing the number of cards, minimizing deck building, both as a way of keeping the focus on make decisions that are meaningful. You don't need to have 20 different cards to have a meaningful gameplay interaction. You can have just a handful, and if they're really well designed, you're going to use them in different ways, and that will be satisfying. That also connects with a very strong Japanese aesthetic in terms of minimalism, which really starts in the medieval era with Zen Buddhism coming to Japan and sort of promoting this idea of simplicity in all things. And that's why you see early on a lot of interest in Japanese culture with design aesthetics. So the game, in terms of combat mechanics and gameplay, is definitely hitting on a lot of those themes. But also, when I look at a lot of other combat games, there's a lot of customization there's a lot of deck building, or there are modifiers that you end up focusing on those as options, and you want to maximize your weapon or status attributes, bonuses in order to win. And I wanted to step away from that, not because it's an invalid approach, but because it's not the lived experience of the medieval Japanese warrior. Most of these, they had to buy their own equipment. So for most of them, they were fortunate if they had armor, and if they had a sword, they had one. So the idea that they were going to, I defeated an enemy, I'm going to upgrade to a new sword, was not really something that happened very regularly. And so I wanted to create a combat system where it was like, you are fighting with your skill, not the weapon. And so the cards are kept minimal. You only have 4 different action cards. You can't upgrade them to a better sword, a better katana. And so it really pushes the game, although it's a war game effectively because it's on a battlefield, it's actually more psychological than it is about the physical sort of violence that would occur between these two warriors. You beat your opponent not by the individual card you play, you beat them by outwitting them, by the series of cards and maneuvers and choices you make.
Well, I will confess to you that my son and I did sit for several seconds between turns staring at each other to try and decide what we were going to do next, because we didn't know what that hidden stance card was, or because we didn't know what card, or should we save cards to defend the next. So no, I think you definitely accomplished that goal for sure. You can't spend a lot of time with analysis paralysis in this game. You've simplified it to that extent, but there's still a lot of decisions to make, and all your cards can do different things.
Yeah, I'm great. It's great to hear that was the experience that you and your son had, because that's what I want. I want it to be difficult to make a decision, in the sense that if you have 3 possible actions, they're all valid and you can easily see how you would play them moving forward. And so that's great, because it means that it's easy to play, because you can't make a wrong decision. But it's sort of nerve-wracking because you're like, I want to do all 3 and they're equally valid. How do I choose? And that's, to go back to the question you were asking before, is how is this uniquely Japanese? Culturally speaking, Shinto is brought into this game. Shinto is the sort of indigenous native religion. I use the word religion loosely, essentially focused on these deities called kami. And kami are featured in Katana, and they act as a vessel for powers that you can use in combat. And this really makes the game very different, not just because you have this god at your back. Other games have, complementary characters. But it's the way that you activate their powers that is unique to Japanese culture. And it operates on this dynamic of pollution and purification. So Shinto, they believe that certain things in the world have a polluting effect, shedding blood, dying things, a woman giving birth. Sometimes they're very random, and other times it's easy to understand why blood may seem to be polluting. In order to counteract any polluting effect, you would purify yourself by presenting an offering to a Shinto god, a kami. And these kami behave in ways that are analogous to like a Greek or a Roman god, in the sense that they will respond to petitioners, but perhaps not in the way that the petitioner would like. They might gain a favorable response, or the kami might kill their family. It really sort of depends on the mood. And so the game reflects that dynamic in terms of each kami having a particular affinity, a personality, a set of active and passive abilities. And if that kami in the course of play is polluted because you've shed your opponent's blood, then you can't use those abilities. So the game becomes a matter of not just trying to defeat your opponent and take away their health and armor, but making a really kind of crass determination. Are you going to be the pious warrior and purify yourself to retain your kami? Or are you going to be a craven shogun and simply use the kami for what you need it for, which is to win the battle, and let it be polluted to oblivion? And that to me is an interesting choice, because when people realize that they have to make this decision, you can see it in their face the first time they play, because they realize like, oh, I might be icky for essentially using my god, right? This is the kami is essentially been granting you all this favor, been giving you all this power, and some people don't want to, balk at the idea that they would sort of use this deity, and to me that is striking. It tells me a couple things. One, that the cultural aspect is coming through, that this idea of pollution and purification is coming across in the game, and that's exciting because that's what I want. But that too, in players understanding that, they're understanding historical experience. The game isn't just about swords. In fact, that's sort of just dressing. And in fact, there's not really, there's, I think, an icon of a sword for attack, but it's really not visually what the focus is on. The focus is on that psychological narrative that each player has to have with themselves about how they are going to win and what is ethically acceptable in achieving that victory.
I really enjoyed the game, I think it's great to talk to you about it, because I sort of felt those decisions, and the artwork and the graphics, I think, did speak to that culture. But I'm so happy to be able to talk to you about how the historical context fits in a game that ostensibly, if you just see it on the shelf, is going to look like a sword fighting game.
Yeah. I mean, part of my approach is I wanted it to be entertaining and not to be edutainment, because I feel that is not appealing to a lot of people. It doesn't excite. The games that are most successful and resonate with people are not coming from the edutainment world. So it's partly a marketing exercise, but it also is, there's also, research and thinking behind the aesthetics. It's not, hey, that looks good, let's do it black and white. Black and white looks great, but part of the thinking there was Zen Buddhism was incredibly important to Japanese culture in the time, still is, and painting and other arts very decidedly moved to a lack of color in the medieval period. You see some use of very pale washes of color, but a lot of black and white ink paintings. And this was believed to be really important to prevent people from being distracted by the material world so they could achieve enlightenment in the next. And so it's this beautiful reason behind an artistic expression, of an aesthetic mode, that when I was working with the illustrator on Katana, told her, we got to do this. We got to figure out a way to make this happen in a way that makes sense for a modern game. And so that's why you see red. It's a very tight color palette. But I feel very passionately about. I love history because I love learning these little things like I just described. Like, who knew that black and white ink paintings had like this seriousness, that had a real weight to them in this culture? That's kind of interesting. And when I tell people these tidbits, they seem interested too. The unfortunate reality is, in order to learn some of these tidbits, you have to sift through a lot. You have to read a lot. And so people get turned off by history. So I want to give them a way to access some of those little nuggets, access, the experiential, general, cultural vibe that they can pull from the past. Because I think people will enjoy it. But if it's too nitty gritty, I mean, I love history, but even sometimes I get bored with the stuff I have to read. I get bored with some of the war games that admittedly are technically superb. But the barrier to entry is so high. And so that's with this game and other games moving forward, it's about being inspired by art history, but doing something new. Because I just think that's cool. I think that's what I want to do.
Well, I agree with you. It is cool, and it's a cool game. And I thank you so much, Tracy, for talking to me today.
Thank you, Dr. Brian.
So that's an overview of Katana, a dueling card game for 2 players that involves those executive functions of inhibition and planning to allow you to manage those hands of cards. If you want to find out more about the game, you can head over to katanacardgame.com. So if you have any suggestions or questions, you can reach me by email at brian@brainsongames.ca. Brainsongames.ca is the website where you'll find all the episodes posted. And you can find Brains on Games on Twitter, on Instagram, and on Facebook. So hopefully you enjoyed this episode. And if you did and you'd like to be notified of future episodes, you can head on over to YouTube and hit that subscribe button. Hopefully we'll see you next time.